Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 7th of October of 2023. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to start with Kupyansk direction, the area where the Russians launched their offensive operation, according at least to some Russian soldiers on the ground and Telegram bloggers and so on, because when talking even the Minister of Defense report, they're saying that as a result of clashes in this direction, the Ukrainians just lost 40 soldiers. So it's a very low level of losses for any offensive operation. Maybe the Russians are trying to hide the real information, the real losses, because they don't want to make people force their attention in this area. They want to keep the operation silent, because the sources are saying that the Russians have already entered the cities like Sinkovka, like they have almost reached the outskirts of Petropavlovka, that the Russians have already bypassed Kislovka-Kotlerovka and almost reached the main road, supply road that goes along this road of N26. Very difficult, but one more time, the Russians are trying to attack the Ukrainians from Lyman along the trees and forests in direction of Kupyansk. The Russians are pushing inside of Sinkovka itself, trying to force the Ukrainians to step back, but the settlement has been almost reduced to ruins, and of course along the fields in direction of Petropavlovka. This is the main and northern direction. The second direction of Russian offense, and the purpose of course of Russian forces, is to establish control over this territory and to get as close as possible to Petropavlovka, Sinkovka, and to eat more territory, to maintain the gray zone, to maintain their flanks positions, and to start and to receive possibilities to establish fire control over the main supply roads that goes in, let's say, in Kupyansk area. So this is the main target, this is the main phase, this is the first phase, and after that there's going to be just the question when exactly the Ukrainians will be collapsed automatically. The next direction of Russian attacks goes from Kislovka-Kotlerovka in direction of Stepovo-Novoselovka. Yesterday we discussed that the Russians have already entered the city, but we haven't received even a single geolocated confirmation about that offensive operation. When talking about Lyman direction, the Russians reported that as a result of clashes in this area, the Ukrainians lost 65 soldiers, and we got a very interesting video from the city by the name of Pesky. The Russians made lots of strikes, missile strikes and artillery strikes, and Skander probably strike against the concentration of Ukrainian forces in the settlement, and as a result of that strike there was a very heavy explosion. Probably the Russians managed to hit some kind of Lyman headquarters or something like this, because this territory is located very far from the main combat line. Furthermore, the Russians attacked the Ukrainian positions in Makiivka along the line Plashanka-Makiivka. We don't know the results of that attack, just the notes and message that there is something in this direction. Now we're moving to Severodonetsk area, and we got also a lot of details and updates from this territory. The Ukrainians published the video how they were bombing and attacking the Russian artillery systems in this area. Lysychansk oil refinery is the main strategical area that is under Russian control. The Russians use this territory to support their forces. There is a lot of underground facilities, there are a lot of storage in this territory, and the Russians do have possibilities to hide equipment in this area. So this is exactly the reason why the Ukrainians pay a lot of attention to this area. They try to establish control, because currently this is the main logistic hub of Russian forces, and the Russians try to complete and to follow like a normal successful counter-artillery duels, and during the previous day they tried and destroyed some artillery systems of Ukrainian forces in this direction. Furthermore, the Russians managed to advance along the railways in direction of Avdiivka. There was a video of that, but we are not going to watch this video because of a lot of casualties among Ukrainian soldiers. When talking about Bakhmut direction, this day, probably the first day in a row since the beginning of this week, when the Ukrainians have almost published nothing. There was just one video of FPV drone strike against the Russian vehicle that were moving in direction of Zaitsev. Probably after Zaitsev, the Russians are planning to move further to Avdiivka to support forces, but the Ukrainians have some certain control, and as a result of FPV drone strike, that light vehicle was damaged, and so we don't even know whether this attack was successful. The Russians from their side continue attacking the Ukrainian forces in Klishchiivka. The Ukrainians continue moving some small groups, 2 or 3 soldiers in the area, trying to probably replace some tired soldiers, to get some positions, to get some snipers and so on. The Russians control the entire situation and try to attack the Ukrainians every time they move. The clashes for Avdiivka continues. The Ukrainians took a decision to send more tanks in this area. This city, Avdiivka, was taken by the Ukrainians in the beginning, probably this week, but later they made more attempts to cross the railways. They were completely defeated. There were a lot of armored vehicles destroyed in the vicinity of the railways, and now the Ukrainians need to start everything from the beginning because the city currently is in the gray zone, and the Ukrainians need to, this is the vital question for them, to cross the railways and to dig in deeper and establish their foothold on the Russian side of railways. And currently they're moving more and more forces, but now the Russians probably has brought some reinforcement that control the entire situation and not allow the Ukrainians to develop their positions. And we got also a lot of strikes, FPV drone strikes against the Ukrainian forces in the vicinity of Ivanovska, in the vicinity and in the area of the main supply roads that goes from Chasov Yar, Konstantinovka to Ivanovska, Klishevka. The Sudoplatov squad published significant number of FPV drone strikes against the Ukrainian forces. So there is no, this is something like death road for the Ukrainians, and the battlefield is completely filled with Ukrainian armored vehicles without any chances to continue offensive operation. But this is just FPV drones, and the Ukrainians are very experienced how to fight with FPV drones. They have solutions. This is not the Israeli army, obviously, that don't know what to do with the FPV drones and with modern warfare types of war. So this is Ukrainians. They know how to fight, and probably they do have possibilities to concentrate forces. They know how to move, how to redeploy forces from one side to another, and obviously this, of course, is a very bad thing for them, but this is not a critical situation as we saw today, for example, in Israeli conflict. Now we are moving further to Avdiivka direction, like the final point of Donetsk front line. The Russians are saying that as a result of clashes on Bakhmut and Donetsk area, the Ukrainians lost 190 soldiers. The level of losses is not so big in comparison with the previous days, but anyway, probably one of the highest. The Ukrainians published the series of FPV drone strikes against the concentration of Russian forces around Avdiivka. Probably the Russians are planning to launch some offensive operation in this area, and that's why they are forced to concentrate like units, and this is like a perfect target for the Ukrainian FPV drones. The Russians from their side continue bombing and, let's say, creating the safe road from Spartak, from Vadiane, from Pisky, from these cities to the north in direction of Tony and Karlovka, and the main purpose, of course, is to create Avdiivka cauldron. So currently the Russians are focused in this area with artillery strikes. They want to create a safe road, and after that to attack to the north. So as we discussed, probably for these purposes the Russians have already redeployed Wagner forces. When talking about South Donetsk direction, currently this is the strongest area, probably how to say. The level of losses is the heaviest on this front line. The Russians are saying about 225 soldiers of losses from Ukrainian side as a result of clashes. As usually, the Russians continue bombing and attacking Novomikhailivka using FAB 500. I'm not even sure, and to tell the truth, it was very difficult every single day to repeat the same things about Novomikhailivka, that every single day this city is under very heavy fire, but the Russians yet haven't started any offensive operation, at least when talking about ground operation, because the fields around the city are still mined. There are no chances to bypass without a proper and normal demining process and clearing process. But as we discussed during the previous week, the Ukrainians managed to discover the Russian concentration of demining equipment, and as a result of HIMARS strike, the Russians lost that possibility. The Russians continue clearing the area in the vicinity of Ugledar. So this bridgehead was captured by the Ukrainians during the previous days' clashes, during the previous offensive operation that took place in August, somewhere in August, and as a result of artillery strike, just another position of Ukrainian forces were destroyed, but no movements on the ground. Obviously, and we're not going to see this obviously in the very near future. And another video of Lancet strike. The Russians managed to discover the Ukrainian artillery system that Ukrainians are using to support their forces in Novomikhailivka and Ugledar. and the Russians managed to discover this system, and as a result of strike, that artillery system was destroyed with Lancet strike, not artillery strike, but with Lancet strike. Anyway, currently this is top focus area for the Russians, but yet without any changes on the ground. And I expect that the Russians are not going to start any offensive because of the crisis in Israel-Palestine. When talking about Avdiivka tactical bridgehead, there are no changes at all, just few videos of the Russian offensive operation in the vicinity of Piryutina and FPV drone strikes. Now we are moving to Zaporizhzhia area. The Russians reported that as a result of artillery duels and clashes in this area, the Ukrainians lost 50 soldiers and 4 armored vehicles. So the level of loss is also on the very low level. The only interesting geolocations we need to talk about is the area in the vicinity of Kupyansk. Probably the Ukrainians somehow, as a result of attacks during the previous days, managed to force the Russians to step back, and currently they have established control over these trenches, and the Russians were forced to start bombing and attacking the Ukrainian positions. So when these fortifications were captured, I can't tell you, but we will adjust the map based on the geolocation we received. When talking about the area Robotina-Verbovo, the situation is completely stabilized, no changes from both sides. The Russians are not counterattacking, and the Ukrainians even probably stop concentrating the forces because they understand that over-concentrated area always means significant losses from their side. Now we are moving to Kherson direction. Today the Russians published a video of strike against some authorities building in Nikopol as a result of FPV strike. Probably the Russians damaged some police office, and so this is just a regular routine on this direction without any changes or like significant result. When talking about Kherson direction, the Russians continue bombing and attacking the Ukrainian forces concentration the cities like Mykolaiivka in the trenches as well. So not such a big result, but anyway just a regular routine, not to allow the Ukrainians to concentrate forces, not to allow the Ukrainians to bring artillery system closest to the Russian bank of the river, just regular things without any attempt from the Ukrainian side to start any offensive operation. More and more fire and artillery bombings we can see in the area of Dachi, the city of Ukrainian force, the city that located along the Antonov Bridge that is under complete Ukrainian control. The Ukrainians continue bringing more infantry on this bank of the river, and the Russians continue attacking and shelling this area with very heavy weapons like towed flamethrower systems, like guided bombs. So the level of usage of this heavy weapon tell us that probably there are a lot of Ukrainian forces who are currently located on this bank of the river. The purpose of this concentration is very, very doubtful, but the Ukrainians are doing this, so that's why probably they have some plans regarding this territory. When talking about the Ministry of Defense report, the Russians reported that as a result of artillery probably and air bombings, the Ukrainians lost 30 soldiers. The level of losses is not so heavy, but it's losses, and it's like a personnel that needed to be replaced or something like this. And another video from Kherson, very rare scene from the city. The Russians managed to discover the redeployment of Ukrainian vehicles, military forces, and as a result of artillery strike, they managed to destroy the Ukrainian armored vehicle and light vehicle with the personnel. Very interesting video are coming from Nikolaev. And the Russians managed to discover the Ukrainian positions, the radar, air defense radar, and as a result of guided bomb strike, that radar was destroyed. Very heavy explosion, and probably the Russians managed to secure the passage for their air forces and drones before upcoming, like let's say, Geran and missile strikes in this area. The Russians continue bombing and attacking Odessa. As a result of those strikes, the Russians continue destroying and reducing till zero the Ukrainian port infrastructure, and the Russians also destroyed and made a strike against the hospital, not the hospital, against the something like a hotel, Chaika, where the Ukrainians tried to concentrate their forces. And this is not the last missile strike all over the entire Ukraine. Furthermore, the Russians destroyed and attacked the Ukrainian positions in Mirgorod. This is the local airport that Ukrainians used before, like Storm Shadow strikes against the Russian positions. They are not keeping their forces, but every time they attack, they're using this airfield to redeploy some forces for a very short period of time, and after they're making strike, they return back also using this airfield. So maybe the Russians got some intelligence information that Ukrainians were planning to attack, and they made a strike before, trying to ruin the Ukrainian plans in this area. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds you we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching, subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.